Hey guys, good afternoon. Another day with Coach Dylan and I answering the life questions that we all need to know. So Dylan is gonna take it away. He's got some stuff that he's been working on, and obviously it's been stuff that we've both been kind of diving into. But I think he's probably got a good understanding of it now, so it'll be a little more interesting to hear what he has to say. So what do we got?
So I guess to start off, just review the concepts of expansion and compression. So my understanding is external rotation is abduction and flexion, right? Or like it's associated with that,
Yeah. So ER, external rotation, is associated with abduction, flexion,
and that's
and expansion.
expansion,
Correct.
and
Yeah.
then that's an inhalation bias.
Correct.
Okay. So then conversely, I guess this internal rotation would be associated with adduction and extension, which would be compression and then exhalation.
Exhalation and internal rotation, correct.
And
So
so that basically means um, that if I have an inhalation bias, I'm good at I'm good at inhaling and expanding,
correct.
and then you're not good at exhaling and compressing.
So
Now, where is that at the pump handle or the like the bucket handle?
okay. So let's back up for 2 seconds and just give a broader zoom out because I think in our previous conversations, like where does all this stuff even matter? It kind of has to have a little bit of context. So when we think about good examples, like you just came out of college not too long ago. What were they teaching for movement? Was there anything about expansion and compression and some of these things, right?
No.
No, and most of it is born off of this kinesiology model that is, what we're starting to figure out now is like it's really hard to see how these tissues actually work in real life when we're examining a dead guy on a table. And I think the other thing too that is hugely important is we're looking at more of this respiratory function that dictates kind of some of these other movement capacities that we never ever associated before. And it kind of plays into a lot of other themes that we may never have really kind of connected with. It's like, well, why is yoga really good for mobility? Well, they focus on breathing, they focus on movement, they focus on all these things. Whereas, like, is that a great way now to treat or train? It depends, right? So like if someone has a inhalation bias and they're already able to inflate and really mobile, do we actually want them doing more of that? I don't know, especially if you see something that hurts. Like if it hurts to go into this like big excursion of external rotation and your main movement for that day is like a warrior two when you're doing this and taking a big breath in, I probably don't think that's going to help you at all, right? So we have to kind of just put into context. I think Bill Hartman has kind of done the best job of putting this together in that there's really only two types of movement, internal and external rotation, right? Everything is something kind of off of that, and it's all based on either we're inhaling or we're exhaling. And it's not always, and I think the hardest part that I struggle with right now is he's like, it's never one or the other. We're always moving through gradients of them both. So if I'm
And it's
going
on a
into,
spectrum.
yeah, it's on a spectrum. And that's what is always nice about the kinesiology model was that it's kind of like, hey, this is it, right? I've got full flexion of the bicep. It causes elbow flexion. I've got contraction. That was at the end of it. It wasn't saying like, all right, well, I'm going through flexion here, which is expansion on one side, compression on the other. But ultimately, they're just moving in between these two ends of the spectrum on some kind of level. And they ultimately are going in both directions all the time almost, right? You're almost kind of constantly changing, which is like, hard to grasp sometimes. So
Yeah, I guess what I kind of learned like the first thing off the bat was that muscles and joints are actually like they're triplanar, as opposed to like one dimensional, I guess, two dimensional, what you learn in school. Like you just say,
exactly.
like this flexes this, the hip flexor raises the thing. It's like everything they explained it like a tetrahedron.
Yes.
And everything is expanding and compressing. Like if it's compressing, I mean, it's got to expand kind of somewhere else. And it's like I said, it's you're either expanding. You only have those two choices to expand or compress.
There was There was a great, actually, it's supposed to be a debate I went to. Oh, must have been like in 2010, and it was with Thomas Myers, who wrote the book Fascial Anatomy Trains, which is all about the fascial system, and it has all these different ideas as to like how slings work in the body and stuff like that. And then there's another guy who had come up with this whole idea of cell structure and how it was a tetrahedron or whatever kind of shape they called it. And what the most interesting part was that when they were talking about cellular design, they're like, if cells didn't have this structure, you wouldn't be able to stack them on top of each other and get this like compressive force that could be able to adaptable. So like one of their examples was, think of like a brontosaurus's neck, right? If it was stacked in these like very like rigid blocks, it would break like constantly. It wouldn't be able to support that huge amount of weight at the head all the way down to the like the base of the body. But because you have this cell structure that's ability to kind of take all these compressive forces and move and shape change, you then have this ability to have these wild excursions of like limbs and stuff like that. And I thought that was really interesting because not only do you need to have a cell that can absorb, but it can be able to bring stuff in and out and create pressure and expansion or shape change in order to accommodate all the different forces it takes on, which is, I mean, it's the stuff that we think about sometimes doesn't need to go down to that level, but it helps, I think, bring a little bit more awareness. Is like, oh crap, if we didn't have that, we'd be in some real trouble, which might be ischemic tissue, or sometimes maybe we put somebody in a cast for 6 months. That's kind of what we've done.
Mm,
All right,
yeah, that's
so
true.
go back to what you were saying.
Um, so I guess the next question from there would be, so we said ER, expansion, inhalation, bias. Now, does that guarantee an ISA, an infrasternal angle?
All
Or is there
right,
something associated with that? I should say, not really guaranteed.
so here's something that I kind of gotten stuck on with this whole thing over the past 8 months or whatever. Um, Wide ISAs. All right, so we have an infrasternal angle, which means the ribs, instead of having what they would call, I think they were saying like 100 or whatever is like the,
Like 110.
yeah, 110 or whatever is like where they at, like that's just it. This thing is like there is no optimal. It's kind of again within this range. So if we have someone
Yeah.
that's rib angle is like that, that's a wide ISA. And what has happened is you have a compressive force on the front and back side of the body that has pushed the ribs now out to the side so that when you breathe in, they pretty much can only go this way and then they can't collapse back down. Right. And um, I think where we get into trouble with that is we still see people that have a loss of ER on in a shoulder with a wide ISA, even though you would assume that they are, biased towards that space anyways.
Mm,
So I don't know. I don't know if that's the guarantee, like you're saying, but I think it's a piece of it.
yeah. Yeah, and I think it's going to depend on some of the other, I guess, tests and stuff that you run,
Yeah. Well, I mean,
or
the
whatever
hard
the
part.
assessments you find, I guess.
Yeah. So like one of the things that we have to kind of take into consideration is that if we look at like if you don't have, you can look at one thing, but without the surrounding pieces to confirm or deny whatever you're looking at, it's hard then to kind of say, like, oh, they've got a wide ISA. That means they probably have a ton of expansion. Well, they could also have another superficial strategy of compression someplace that then locks up a joint, right? So like they may actually lose ER even though they have a rib cage that is telling us that they should be biased towards ER.
Hmm. So I guess where the next like piece of information that I went over was yielding and overcoming, which
Mm.
I don't think we've talked about at all. Which where does that kind of tie into this type of stuff? Your understanding of it, anyway.
So yielding and overcoming are basically our concentric and eccentric orientations, right?
Yeah.
And what's really interesting with this stuff is, again, it's not like, oh, eccentric is just this like lengthening kind of spot where we're always kind of slowly lowering weight. What we may have is a yielding position where if I'm sliding into my left hip, right, I'm kind of shifting back into it. I have to yield on the posterior side of the hip in order for the femoral head to slide out the back. right? Now, to propel myself back out of that hip, I have to have an overcoming contraction on the backside to push it back through. So you always have these kind of spaces where, all right, I have to have this yielding moment, even though it's still contracted, right? The tissue's still on because it has to slow it down. And it's the yielding part of that would be like, all right, if I have a yielding eccentric, I have a moment where that tissue is expanding and being able to slow things down a little bit. And then I have a yielding concentric where all of a sudden I stiffen it back up where I can kind of pause it. And then I have an overcoming concentric where I shoot it back the other direction.
Yeah, so the example they gave, like they said, yielding is typically more so eccentrically oriented,
Yes.
and then overcoming, you're producing force, so you're more so concentrically oriented. But it could be switched depending on, I guess, the modality of the exercise. So they gave an example of pogo hops. It would be more concentrically yielding.
I think the best way to look at it is Bill Hartman has a video on gait, right? Where as
Yeah.
one leg swings through, I have an overcoming contraction on this leg, the swing leg, and I have a yielding eccentric contraction on the recuperating leg, right? And then you have this opposite switching back and forth. I think the other piece too that can become crucial in some understanding some of this stuff is that if I need an expansive strategy on a tissue, I probably want to bias it towards a yielding contraction.
So if you want to bias expansion,
So if we were to say, all right, I've lost internal rotation or external rotation on a hip joint. Okay. So let's just go with external rotation. Let's say I've lost external rotation on a hip joint. I can go at it through a couple different ways. We know flexion's associated. We know abduction's associated with it. And we know an inhalation is associated with it. So if I want to try to regain maybe ER on that side, I might put them in an eccentrically yielding position. So maybe that's going to be um, a single leg squat with plantar flexion, right? With my heel elevated, which is going to bias an inhalation strategy on that side. And then I can slowly lower them into hip flexion as I do it. I don't necessarily need to stretch out in external rotation to try to recapture it. I can do it through training, which is like the whole reason why we kind of are. I think it's important for us to learn this stuff is because like we may be missing something on the table, or if we see it doesn't look right when we're training somebody, we don't have to immediately regress back to like, all right, we got to do something like pigeon stretches, right? Maybe we can recapture it with actually training modalities based on biases that we know they may need or that they lack or that they're already in. So if I'm trying to recapture usually one of those ranges of motions, I'm going to bias it towards something that is associated with it and also probably go with an eccentric kind of component. Now, here's the thing is like, let's say I'm trying to capture ER on the left hip. I could also potentially go after IR in a yielding or a concentric fashion to force the back part of the hip to do the exact opposite. You know what I'm saying?
kind of. So you would IR the left hip.
We could.
But let's see what happens, I guess.
So
And
here's a great example of this. The right side lying adductor pull back, right? I'm trying to recapture internal rotation on that left side, but at the same time, I may recapture some external rotation because as I pull that left hip socket back into the capsule and I internally rotate it, that back side has to yield to the interior compression of the front side.
gotcha.
Right. And that's also where we may miss the boat where sometimes we're like, man, why can't someone slide their hip back in that position? Like, you know how like we see them sometimes they're lying there and they just go to pull back and it doesn't go anywhere. Well, is it because the left adductor can't get in the right spot or get on for it to work? Or is it because the posterior side of that is still in a concentric oriented position and we can't get it to shut off? Right. So maybe we go back and we do some kind of hip flexion based something or abduction or anything to kind of maybe help orient it a different way and breathe into that space a little bit more and then go back and see if we can fix it again. Here's the thing, is like, I don't know. I'm still kind of like figuring it out. There's moments where it comes through and you're like, oh man, this worked really well. And then there's moments where you're sitting there going like, this makes no sense to me. I'm completely lost again.
been there this last couple days.
Yeah, I know.
So I guess with the main confusion with the stuff that I sent you the other day, so like I asked the guy, so for like a narrow ISA, that's you're compressed in that space. So it said like you want to give them more compression, and that didn't make sense to me. But I guess they were talking about the pump handle. So higher up, they're super expanded. So you would want to compress that space to allow the other space to expand better. Which I just like. Obviously, now it makes more sense, but I don't know. That wasn't very clear when I was reading
So, here's the hard part. Think of like the wide ISAs, do they look compressed or like, or even look at the narrow ISAs that do they look like they're hyperinflated?
Not really, I don't think. Some of them.
So what's hard is like I think of some of our people that I've seen like a wide ISA, and typically they look very inflated up here, right? And we know that they need this compression strategy, pull it back down. And in terms of our narrow ISAs, usually they're kind of pulled down, and what they say is like, was it loss of kyphosis and a compressed pump handle, or is it expanded pump handle?
They have compressed infrasternal ribs in the inhaled axial skeleton, so they're expanded in the axial skeleton.
So that's the part where I'm also not 100% sure in terms of because like you have the ISA is a reflection of usually the superficial strategy on top of the skeletal like anatomy, right? So if I've got someone that has a narrow ISA, it's usually on top of an inhaled axial skeleton, which means you're going to have a different sacrum mutation than what the ribs are typically presenting, right? And what's always hard for me to kind of like put into practice is like, does this really matter? Like, I don't know. I feel like you could sit there and think about the minutia of a sacrum turning or nutating, and this rib cage kind of counteracting it. But ultimately, are we, so if I have a narrow ISA and I'm going to deadlift them, or squat them, I should say, how much of a change am I expecting to have in a sacral angle or not get in a sacral angle that's going to affect then my pump handle action on my rib cage? I don't know.
Yeah. So another thing that I had trouble understanding was what actually nutation and counter nutation even were. So is that specifically just a term used for the sacrum? Or most often,
I saw it someplace else when they were talking about.
So I guess specifically for the sacrum, it just means that the sacrum would, if it absorbs shock, that would make it yielding. I don't even know if that's important, but just tying the two concepts together.
So here's actually a super important thing that helped me over the past week, or over the past like couple of weeks. Your sacrum, right, moves independently of the pelvis. All right. And I think one of the things that was kind of eye-opening to me is like when Bill Hartman was talking about recapturing external rotation or internal rotation at the hip, right? You're typically looking at all the tissue connections below or around like the trochanter of the femur, right? So all this stuff that we think about, like upper, outer, like glute med and higher up on the pelvis, doesn't really have that much of effect on some of those orientations. But what does happen is it changes the angle of the sacrum, right? And if my sacrum can't tip forward and backwards with the pelvis moving those directions, I then lose the ability for the femur that are attached into that sacral space to actually like move the way it's supposed to, right? So then I'll lose muscle, I'll lose activation around the hip joint. And what's been interesting is like, I think about like the spinal cars, like exercise, and how getting the whole pelvis to tip, and then the spine to tip with it, so that we get this full excursion of extension through everything, and then reverse it into flexion. I think helps kind of, I don't want to say mobilize, but reorient those tissues to start working and moving those segments so that as the pelvis goes into one direction, the sacrum can counter nutate or nutate in the opposite, so that when you stand up, right, now it has the free ability to move again under maybe load, which is your compressive force, to be able to absorb it the way it's supposed to. Because if I can't get the segments around in the spine or the pelvis to move, the sacrum can't move. And if the sacrum can't move, we already know through that PRI neck course, the sacrum, the sternum, and the sphenoid are all of our things that are like our rudders that allow us to orient ourselves in space the best.
So with nutation, what's the action of the sacrum? Is it moving down?
So
So
nutation.
this is the backside.
Yeah, it's nutating. Counter nutation is like tucking under.
So nutating would be like it doesn't follow the pelvis, but it basically would be like anteriorly tilting.
Yeah, right. And that's the hard part.
Not the pelvis itself, but the sacrum's anteriorly tilting.
From my understanding, right, this is where I kept getting really jacked up. Was like, all right, anterior pelvic tilt, counter nutation of the sacrum. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, how the hell does the tailbone tuck underneath while the pelvis is rolling forward? Because they don't move at the same thing. Yeah. But I guess that's what happens.
I mean, with anterior pelvic tilt, you don't see people's tailbones jutting out of their backside. So I guess
no. Well, that's
if it all moved at once, you'd probably see that thing.
Well, you would then see though. You're right. You would see the whole maybe like this like spoiler coming off the back of someone's head.
Like you actually have a tail.
Yeah.
So I guess
that's that I never thought of it like that. That is actually a very good point.
But I mean, you don't see it with the other way either. But I don't think you would. You don't see a lot of posterior pelvic tilts. But
I probably have.
It's kind of an extreme anyway.
Yeah, well, I probably have it looked someplace, but the degrees that we're talking about might be 0 to 5, right? Yeah. So we're literally talking about this very minute amount of movement in conjunction with this other thing. So I mean, it may be even less than that. I don't know.
I think what's helped me is they demonstrated with like a pelvis or whatever, like whatever you call the fake skeleton things or whatever.
Yeah.
But it just shows you how everything kind of moves. So it was like when it was the sacrum was tucking underneath, like it shows how everything else, like the pelvic bones,
right? You both iliums have to come around. Or
whether they're expanding, compressing, rotating, all that stuff.
And what's even harder with this is just like everything else, it's not that we have this fixed structure like this. We think of the pelvis as this bowl. But in reality, it's 2 hemispheres that are moving like this, like constantly, and they also can do this, and it's just like holy crap. And then you have the outlets underneath that are where some of the other attachments are coming in. That as the iliums do this, the outlets kind of go like that. It's like, well, what does that actually do? Oh, it increases like the ability for the femur to change in position. So you've already suddenly changed femoral function by, when you breathe in, and maybe this, or actually when you breathe in, it should expand, and when you exhale, it comes back up. So like you're constantly, like it goes back to our first thing, we're constantly changing the orientation of these joints and bones just with the respiration, right? And that's also why I think it's super important that if we're trying to regain or capture mobility, you probably, if you're not breathing, like it's impossible to regain it. So like any type of static stretching where you have to hold your breath, I think you've already lost.
Gotcha.
So after learning about some of this stuff, how do you think we would apply it to training? Like, where does it fit in?
I think it's important. I think where we use it most, I don't know, it's tough to say because the numbers are different. We have more athletes than we do older adults. So I was going to say, I feel like we use it more in personal training. But we use a decent amount with our youth athletes. But then again, we're limited with what we can do because we don't have like that one-on-one time. But I guess it's important to, in pain management for either ones. And also just giving them, they always talk about giving them what they don't have. So it's like, what issues are being caused because of their lack of something? And if it's something major, and we can give them that, does that help their performance, whether that's them as an athlete, or does it just help them better that, you know, enhance their quality of life or whatever, like their daily tasks. You've got someone in pain all the time, and we can kind of use some of this stuff, I guess, to take it away, but also give them the training effect. And it's pretty important for their user experience for the services that they're looking for.
I think where it becomes hugely important is like, so, you know, Alex, one of our best soccer players, was like, yo, my left hip feels really tight, doesn't feel good. Right. And it's not stopping him from doing anything. But when we just had him do a couple of table tests on his hips, you could see there's a huge discrepancy between the two of them. Right. And all we did was a little lacrosse ball to the left hip, and then had him do like a single leg kind of squat hold where he's shifting back into the left side and reaching and feeling that left posterior expansion in that backside. And changed. He's like, I don't, like, my left leg feels better. I don't have any pinching in the front of my hip anymore when I pull into full flexion. And I'm sure now when he goes to play, he's got both legs a little bit more underneath him, and at least he won't be exaggerating something too far to one side. What's always hard is distinguishing where does this actually matter? Because if I have someone that isn't going to chase high level performance, isn't in pain, is just doing their normal crap, it probably doesn't matter at all, right? They're never pushing outside that spectrum that's going to cause either a really sharp bias to one side, because that's the strategy they like to use all the time, or
like someone like Jen.
You know, like an overcompensation position. Yeah, like it's almost like, you know, you just be like, all right, just train as normal. The only thing though is, like, as you train harder, you're going to start going towards that space. So
yeah, it's
you got to
gonna come at a cost, probably.
Yeah, because it will come at a cost at some point. And at the same time, you're always thinking too is like, well, how much do I need to dial these things back so we don't reach that issue? But I also don't want to rob them of performance. So like, I think of like a golfer or someone that is like really at the top level. They're like, even a pitcher, right? You're not going to all of a sudden be like, all right, go start throwing baseballs with your left arm if you're a righty. You know, like, we don't, that doesn't, you're going to spend more time training the other side that you could be honing in this right side that'll get you to that next level you want to do. But you do have to then be mindful of like, all right, if I can't feel this left shoulder doing what it's supposed to, I probably still need to invest in that so that you can actually still resist the forces that you're delivering on this other side that are now so much more dominant. So I don't know. I wish there was a better checklist to be like, oh, once they reach this threshold, you probably need to really investigate these other things and start to push them more in. Up until that point, you know, just kind of give them good training. I think though our table tests now are pretty quick, that we can get a pretty accurate representation. So like, all right, if someone comes in and we can't get them into full hip flexion, then and they've lost some extra rotation, we were probably doing a lot of our split squat variations or squat variations with a heel lift, right? You know,
what about like, if I think one of the assessments was it was supine knee to chest, but it wasn't like we do it where you take their knee, you know, actively take their knee up there or whatever. Can they get there themselves? Is there a relation to that? So let's say like you take my knee, I'm on the ground, and I can get to the hip extension I need to, and that you put it back on the ground, and now you have me try to get hip extension, and I only get like 90 degrees, whereas I was getting like 120 or whatever before. What do you do then?
So that's
or are those results like, do they say
do they match up? So I mean, this goes into the functional conditioning stuff, like the FRC, the hip cars, like all those things that we do. Yeah. There's some pretty good stuff that shows the relationship between active and passive mobility can be a very big indicator as to like whether or not I'm going to get hurt, right? If I can passively get my shoulder to here, but actively I can only get it to here, I have a ton of space that is allowable, but I can't consciously get there. I can't use it. So like, I think the guy that does all the FRC stuff, Andrea Ospina, I don't know his first name, something like that. He's saying, I think he was saying like the literature calls it workspace. If my workspace is, you know, passively, man, I can hammer this stuff out, but then my active ability is very limited compared to that, there is a huge gap neurologically that I can access. And it kind of can become an issue. So I think that you have to be a little bit mindful of, all right, if I can pull my knee all the way in my chest, like, so you know what, here's a perfect example. Like if we were to do like back in the day, the psoas was like this, end of all like things. If your psoas wasn't right, your back was gonna be jacked up. You're under threat. Nothing worked right. Digestion, like all this crap. Now it's kind of like we look at it and like it's just another piece of the puzzle. But the test that we used to think was if I couldn't stand against a wall and bring my knee up past 90 without some kind of compensation, I had some serious hip flexor issues that needed to be addressed. All right, and the other thing you could do, or the same test would be, all right, I'm going to pull this up as high as I can and then let it go, and can I hold it there? Yeah. Right, and again, but if you saw this, right, you knew that there was a gap between how well that tissue could be controlled, or that joint could be controlled. And I think it's the same idea in that, yes, it's kind of it could be another indicator, but I wouldn't say that it's now, like I used to think active versus passive was very important. Now I just kind of see like, all right, can they get there? And then how do we train them so that they can maintain what we think would be like adequate?
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, makes sense too. With like if we look at my active straight leg raise, which was another assessment they went over that you can use, and like I can't get my leg very high, but you take my leg and it goes. It's it's a little reluctant, but it goes probably to where it needs to. But
so let's back it up in 2 seconds, because that used to be one of the like FMS and SFMA's big thing was, hey, do I have a tissue locked joint, right? And that the tissue won't extend because of, it was in a cast, or it's just been so stagnant for so long that it won't slide? Or is it a neurally locked joint? Like a neural locked joint would be this one, in that passively, no problem. But as soon as that brain gets involved to actively pull it in place, it gets stuck, right? What I think that actually is a better indication of is, man, that should be super easy to fix, because all it is changing the brain's input. Like I don't have to do anything else. So if I have someone that comes in with like you, with like an active straight leg raise that is like, man, it only goes up to here, but then when I take your leg, it goes perpendicular to the ground. We have all this capacity somewhere, right? It just needs to be unlocked. And usually that's taking the brakes off of whatever the brain perceives as threat, and then it should come like restore pretty quickly. So like those are always like, that's always your best case. So if you said to me though, what's a better way, I think, to figure out how to treat that, I would go with, all right, is it a wide ISA? Is it what ranges of motions have we lost? I wouldn't just say like, oh, we have an active straight leg raise, let's try to neurologically like PNF the crap out of it, which you can still do, right? It still works on some people, but it's almost like, for me, I found
there's a quicker way to get the same result.
Yeah, it's like a 50-50. The other thing too is like, I don't want to have to be there or have them spend 10 minutes doing like a contract and relax and try to gain some of that back, only to go train and then 5 minutes later it's gone, right? Whereas if I put you in the right position during training and give you some influences through that based on our other assessments, I shouldn't have to do any of that shit, and I can still actually train you pretty hard.
Yeah.
Have you watched any of the Facebook Live videos I've done with the Sailor Sneakers ones?
I think I watched one of them briefly.
So I mean, it's just as much for me as it is for the other people, because what's crazy is I'll check my toe touch and those things in the beginning, and by the end, in some cases, like, man, is money, and I've got my heart rate up a little bit, and I feel pretty good, and that is I think a great example of, hey, your rehab program doesn't have to look like rehab. We're doing split squats, we're doing SSL DLs, we're doing running, we're doing some of these other like external rotation positions and breathing, and like my heart rate gets up pretty high on some of those things. I was like, you'll hear me and it'd be like, I'm starting to sweat, I really don't want to do this anymore. And that's the thing, is we don't have to be handcuffed by this stuff. I think it should allow us to blend the needs of the athlete or the needs of the person with their training goals and seamlessly be able to move back and forth.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've been doing the online trainings twice a week for sporting or whatever, and just like talking and all that stuff. I'm like, I'm tired. And at the end, like, I'm like, wow, I actually like sweat more than I did when I like lifted earlier in the day. But like, I'm on like a tempo
Yeah.
So I guess that's probably why. And I'm like, literally, it's just like body weight stuff.
Stuff.
I'm like, I'm freaking tired.
You know, you bias somebody in the right position, and it'll feel like they're moving 1,000 pounds. Like you know that, like like when all of a sudden we shift something in the right spot, like, oh my god, I can feel it. You tighten up and you tense because holy cow, I've never been here before. I haven't been here in a very long time. If you can then reinforce that and load that, I think that's ultimately like our biggest like moneymaker exercise. And if we can hammer that enough, that's where you see the adaptations we want. And
To give a training effect and a rehab
correct,
effect at once.
correct.
Got you.
I will say the other thing too is what's tough about this stuff is how often do you need to do it? And I think the more I've prescribed things for people as based off of what we see their assessment, our best results are from the ones that are doing it like 3 or 4 times a day consistently. And then all of a sudden, like a week into it, they're like, man, I feel really good. Or you can do them kind of like half-assed, like once a day or every other day for like 4 weeks and still not see an appreciable change. So I think you're always also overcoming your body's natural bias towards whatever it was in the beginning. And you have to start to figure out how do I be aware of what it is that I'm actually doing that's causing it. Because if you can remove that, you've already pretty much won. And if I can load this other stuff on top of it, I've now reinforced this idea that I don't always have to go back to that well that I've basically run dry.
Yeah. And so back to the question, I guess, where you asked, where do I find it to be more important? It just popped into my head with like the yielding and overcoming stuff with like athletes. I've seen like a couple posts recently on like Instagram about people that are chronically injured from certain things, or even I guess with me, like the tendonitis thing. Is that like I saw Mike Robertson and Pat Davidson, they were talking with two other people, and Robertson was talking about a athlete he had, and I believe he had like chronic injury stuff, and he didn't have the ability to like absorb force, and that's I guess. So I was thinking about yesterday about myself was, maybe you're overtraining a little bit, but also like my patella tendons lack the ability of I guess yielding or absorbing that force, all that decelerative stuff. So I guess that's where it would also be really important to understand what an athlete needs to help them further down the line, because eventually there's probably going to be a threshold they get past and now they're injured. And if you don't
So,
understand, I guess, this concept, you don't really know how to approach that.
well, you could use all the standard modalities of like ice and soft tissue work and stretching, but have you actually solved anything? You might feel a little bit better, but that's why it's always like, oh yeah, I went back to playing sport and it started to bug me again. But a perfect example is like Sage, right? Chronic knee stuff, and I don't know if I have any data on her. I think she was a wide ISA, right? And what we found was that anything that we did, she wore shoes that were like this thick in the heel, right? So she's already biasing towards expansion with that stuff. Anything that was squatting bugged the crap out of her knees. So everything we did was let's just bias her back towards compression, right? Everything was deadlifts, hinging, toes up on everything. Her knee pain went away in like a week and a half, and it didn't come back the whole winter until she was still playing soccer and we reintroduced split squats and lunging. And then also she's like, yeah, I started to bug me again. So we just took it right back out. Right. And like, is that something where I'm like, all right, are we still missing the boat on something? Yeah, probably. Right. There's probably still something that we haven't completely addressed, but we can still train and she can still play without anything. At one point I would hope we could reintroduce that stuff without some kind of painful repercussion, but like, I don't know necessarily where to do that. But yeah,
And
I don't, so
maybe,
here's the thing. Is it because she couldn't eccentrically absorb? I don't know. I think you might be right. I just don't know how we would necessarily test that very well, or how
yeah,
you
and my
would
first
correlate it
thought
with
would be, I
everything
guess
else.
that's where the tempos would become important, I guess.
Yeah.
Isometrics, and I mean, you're producing force there too, and you're absorbing it, I guess. But the eccentrics as well, slowing things down and really teaching that tissue like you need to absorb this, as opposed to just bouncing out of positions and whatnot.
Go back in your own training. What would you, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?
With my knee stuff,
Yeah.
I don't know. I would probably have I found a way to like take it easy. Like I wasn't playing. I guess I would have had to introduce what my thought process now is probably introduce more um, absorb like maybe eccentrics and stuff like that, and teach that tissue how to absorb force better. Because like even after not playing a while, I don't know if it was just because it was damaged for so long, but like I didn't play. I played like once a week competitively in the winter for 8 weeks. Didn't really do much in the spring in terms of playing, but like when we played spike ball, or if I ran around too much during my own training sessions while coaching, I was like, it's starting to bug me a little bit. And then, fall came around and I would like hop in during the southern sessions, not for long, and it would start to bug me a little bit again. And that's when I had to use that pre-rep stuff again. And I'm like, it's been so long. Why does it still bug me?
So we probably would think about, all right, is it the patella tendon that can't do that? Or is it something either below or up that chain? So like, I mean, the other thing too that this has taught me drastically to think about is like, if you're not addressing stuff proximally, the crap distally probably won't change. So like ankle issues and stuff like that, you probably, you can do all the ankle mobility you want, but if I haven't addressed maybe a compressive force on the hip that's shifting that joint or that tension someplace, it's going to go right back.
Yeah.
So like, I think about you, I think like, is it your patella tendon or is it more of like, man, my hamstrings aren't able to eccentrically orient?
Yeah.
Because your active straight leg raise still sucked.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember when me and Bryce shot all those videos of the posterior chain stuff, I was like, my knees feel really good like the next day or two. And I don't know if I was being a little bit impatient. Like, oh, I could spend 6 months, they should be perfectly fine. And it wasn't like they hurt the same amount, but I could feel it start to creep back again. So I'm sure I think it was just a wide variety of things. And if not, it was just something that we hadn't figured out yet. But I think it was, remember, like my calves and stuff were super tight, and doing like the Aldoa and the other thing, that stuff seemed to help. But then I think maybe we were missing or could have added in some of the stuff with some ER and IR stuff to see, I guess, how that would have played into some of those things.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and that's the hard part. And what I would say another big takeaway, which we were doing a little bit beforehand anyways, is like, if you don't see a pretty drastic change in something, like pretty quickly after like an intervention, it's not the right thing. Like you missed something, because when you hit it the nail on the head, almost always it has this very rapid change, right? Where people go from like, I can barely touch my knees on a toe touch to like, oh, I touch my shoelaces. Like that's the type of stuff that we should be seeing. Or, like a good example is like, yeah, we did Alex's assessment, and he went to do an adduction drop test, and his left leg was literally hanging up in the air. So if he was supposed to be down to the floor like this, it was straight up, right? And he was like, oh, geez. And I was like, yeah, that's not good, right? Like that should be able to fall. And we did that again. We didn't actually do anything to his adductor. We just went and stretched out his posterior hip capsule on that left side with a standing like single leg squat in an SSL DL position. And he did it, and he brought the leg back around, and it dropped much easier. He's like, oh, it feels way better, right? And that's the type of stuff you should be able to find pretty quickly. And I think without the proper assessment or some of this understanding that you're talking about, you're going to gloss over a lot of stuff. Or you may try something like, well, that was it. I got nothing else in my toolbox. Whereas like there's always probably something else we can try.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's where I think this stuff starts to get important too, is what do you find, and then that's where I guess exercise selection becomes pretty important as well.
Yeah.
Whereas you think a lot of people you see on like Twitter or Instagram, or people arguing like whatever, and like it really doesn't matter the exercise you choose, as long as it's coached well or whatever. Like it's almost like a random thing. Oh, this looks good. It's probably fine. Like, is it?
So it goes back to our previous thing, right? To some degree, yes, right? We have young kids that haven't maybe gotten into these like complete biases, or they don't have any issues. I mean, as long as it's good training, like again, I don't want people sitting there saying like, oh, doing a burpee into a backflip is like good training. It's like, no, this isn't the circus, right? And like, there's no point do I have to see that anywhere. But if you're saying like, oh, should they all be doing like a split squat variation? Like, yes. And that as long as they're coached well, I think you're okay. As we get further down the line and we start to see maybe people trend towards different things, now it becomes like crucially important. If I want to extend someone's career or if I want to actually get them to the next level, what might be holding them back is this huge asymmetrical limitation, right? Because they can't actually get to the other side to get power or things start to hurt. So like, yeah, then you're like, yeah, this isn't a universal exercise for somebody in that case. And you have to test to figure it out. You can't just say like, oh, well, we do this with all of our football players and he's a football player. It's like, no. But well, let's finish on this because I think this is actually a good point. With your soccer team, how does this change stuff for you coaching a group like that?
In a group?
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess I would have to figure out a way to kind of see. If it was important enough, I would have to figure out a way to see where most of them are biased or what they're lacking, and if that's causing them issues. Like right now, they're 12, 13 years old. I don't think many of them have many issues that are causing them pain or limitations. But I guess figuring out, what the majority have and treating that, or just, like you don't have the time and manpower at that level to figure out every single one and give them stuff to do on a one-on-one basis. But also, like you just said, it's like, is it that important right now, or do we just need to install good training? And I think if you just install good training, like we were doing different push-up tempos, introducing them to that, the single leg work, sprint stuff, plyos, as long as I think you take a smart approach, it's not really going to bug anyone. And then if it does bug anyone, it's going to be rare enough where you can probably treat that one-on-one, like separately. As opposed to, you have 12 girls on a team and 10 of them have all these different things. It's like, something's probably wrong. You're probably doing something wrong here. It's like,
yeah, we're no longer running with each other on each other's backs.
Yeah. So like, if we want to just finish up with, I guess, the exercise selection stuff, with like squats, the hinges, so deadlift, and then upper body pressing, and just kind of what you would go into with wide and narrows.
What do you got?
Because this is the stuff that I think you'll probably use the most, I guess, and it's probably important, pretty important to understand. So I guess with squatting, a YISA would struggle. They would struggle with the squat, right?
So here's where I got confused with that a while ago. When Pat Davidson first introduced it, I don't know if he had it correct in one of his power hours. And he said that because I have a inhalation bias, wide ISA, I have a what would be associated with flexion, external rotation, and abduction. I mean, that's like kind of squatting to full depth.
It's like a back squat.
Well, right? Here's the thing is, what happens with a squat is once you hit, there's a certain point, like mid-propulsion area, where the femurs actually start to go into IR, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's where they would say, like, yeah, you're going to have a really hard time squatting because you're biased towards ER. You can never get back into IR to actually full range squat. So
gotcha.
I don't know.
So one of the other tests or the assessments was a deep squat.
Yeah.
And it said if you get stuck at about 90 degrees, you're probably compressed, which would mean you're likely a wide ISA, right? So if you can't drop deep enough, I guess that's what would mean like you're not good at squatting.
So again, I'm like, there's like 2 weeks ago, I was like, I'm done with this. I can't handle any more of it. The ISA is just kind of a reference point. It doesn't mean, because like you could have a wide ISA, but you could have compression on the posterior part of the pelvis and not as much on the anterior part, I guess, which would leave space to go into interrotation and have loss of external-rotation. So like it wouldn't present the same. So you can have superficial strategies kind of all over the place. What the wide ISA I think I would use more now is just to dictate kind of like their breathing strategy. I need you to get those ribs down. I need you to find the external obliques to hold that rib cage in place. Whether we're doing it in a squat, the thing is, like with a wide ISA, that's already somebody, it's an inhaled strategy. Would you think you would need a heel lift for them to squat if they're already like biasing towards that? Like, no. But in most cases, right, I'm still throwing heel lifts under everybody during squatting because they've got some other crap going on that is over on top of that stuff. So
Yeah.
what confused me the most with all those is that it seemed like a hard and fast rule about, hey, why did I say is going to suck at squatting? Don't, like, you shouldn't squat them. But at the same time, it's like, all right, well, if they've got an inhalation bias and they need compression, does that mean I deadlift them? And they're like, well, no, because they're already compressed sometimes on the back too much. It's like, all right, well, so then what do I do? You know, like, I think you have to be cognizant of just where it leads you to start to preface something and then try it and then see does it work.
Yeah, because what they basically said was, elevate the heels and then use like a zerker squat, goblet, or like a front rack variation. And then if you're narrow, you would probably need more IR, adduction, and compression. So spend time going into what would be, I guess, mid propulsion. So like box squats, safety bar squats, and even barbell back squat if it looks good enough and if they need to do it. Spend that time in that mid propulsion. You don't need to drop all the way down, which is kind of confusing because they can get all the way down.
So here's the other thing too that I think Bill Hartman was really good about when he was testing infrasternal angle was, is it dynamic? Right? So is it dynamic? Does when they breathe in, does it expand and then come back down? So they may be starting at a wider position and it may expand, but then it closes again. It's probably not that big of a deal. Same thing with it's narrow, but it expands and comes back. Say it again.
That's probably where that spectrum of being wide to narrow comes into play because
so if I have a dynamic rib cage, I probably am not going to be as limited or have to be so specific with some of these things. I still may need help, but it's not going to drastically dictate anything. So like when I think about myself, like I have a pretty dynamic narrow ISA. I can squat with a heel lift really well, and I can deadlift and hinge really well. The thing is, like, what screws me up the most is that I overly compress in the back part, right? And what's really been apparent recently is that the whole left AIC pattern, I've got a ton of compression on my left posterior hip, which then makes my tailbone like not want to move very well, and I can feel it get kind of stiff right in like the lumbar sacral junction. But that's also like, I think like one level above it is where I herniated a disc too, playing soccer in college. So I've got all these things that are playing there. When I reorient that stuff pretty well, like I get back into my left hip, I can feel it stretch out, I can breathe and do those things. Like everything feels amazing. I can touch my toes really well. I can do all this stuff. As soon as I start to lift heavy, which is a compressive strategy, and I start to kind of continually like bear down on that stuff, it starts to get stiff and then I got to regain it again. So is it because I have a narrow ISA or a wide ISA? Like, I don't think so. I think it's just the adaptation to lifting heavier stuff is these structures get tighter and more compressed, and I need them to specifically be mobile on one side because my bias is to really go in the opposite direction.
Yeah. So with hinging patterns, so narrow ISAs would struggle with the deadlift because of a counter nutation bias. So it says they can't get sacral nutation, they can't get that to flex. So I guess what happens is it just occurs in one spot up on the chain, which would be the lumbar spine, which I guess makes, for me, being narrow. And I remember you were looking at me deadlift one time and you're like, I think you need to elevate it.
Yeah.
Because I was flexing somewhere. So I guess, maybe that would be an exercise selection or a modification. If you're going to straight bar deadlift, then you might just need to elevate it up. And so like the things that they used for this was, like I said, you could conventional barbell deadlift, but elevate the toes for narrows. A Kapari deadlift with that, which I don't know what it is. And then a single leg deadlift in acetabular femoral movement. I don't know what that means yet, but that's what they said with external rotation.
So acetabular femoral.
They said it's like a hip shift. I just didn't really understand the concept yet. I didn't spend time looking at it. I just learned.
Well, this is just lingo stuff. Like you have like femur, so leg, acetabulum. If I move the femur on the acetabulum, that would be like hip abduction, right? Now it's the same thing if I move the acetabulum over the femur, right? I just slide my pelvis this way. It's still abducting the femur, right? And I haven't moved it. I still have to have these muscles doing their job. So that would be like, I think a lot, again, going back to some of the stuff that we see, a lot of times our biggest money maker exercises are ones where we're sliding a pelvis over a femur as opposed to moving a leg. So like if we think about like mini band walks compared to maybe like a single leg, something where if a mini band walk is doing that with my hip, if I were to do something like this and I shift into that side, I can now feel those abductors doing their job without having to, move a femur. I'm actually shifting my hip over that spot.
Gotcha. So with exercise selection, the concept of giving them what they don't have, does that equal having them do something that they're not comfortable or great at? If that makes sense. Like it says narrow ISA struggle with a deadlift because of what we just talked about, but then it says have them conventional deadlift, but with the toes elevated.
See, this is where I don't know. I feel like you have to test it because same thing, again, listening to like Bill Hartman, or actually listening to like Pat Davidson, one of the things he says, like, if I know they're going to struggle with this because of these biases that they have, dude, just give them what they're already good at, right? And they can be successful right away. You have to be careful because that might overload something and cause an issue down the train. It makes me think of like, all right, so if I'm going to elevate a deadlift so that they can actually do it, and that's my loading pattern, what am I maybe doing on the back end so that they can feel that full excursion? Because if I just, if I just use this compressive force in a shortened range of motion, I will lose sensation someplace at some point, right? Like that, the adaptation will then become stiffer in that spot, which if you're a power lifter and that's the depth you have to get to, probably awesome. But in terms for us, in terms of athletics, like the last thing we actually want is our kids to get so stiff that they can't rotate. And that's the first thing that goes when you create that much stiffness and compression, which is why sometimes maximal strength has a very detrimental effect to athletics. It's not always stronger is better. So
are you too strong?
Yeah. So what you might want to think about is, all right, if I'm going to elevate them and my main loading strategy is a rack pull, right? Or elevated trap bar deadlift. What am I going to do then to recapture some of that range of motion that they A, haven't experienced, but B, they're definitely going to lose because of all the compression it created using that heavy load. That might be, all right, now we go into like a deep squat position and hold it, or maybe like an SSL DL where I can really kind of focus on reaching and opening up that space in the same pattern, right? It's still a deadlift, but I'm actually able to go through the full range of motion. That might be where we get like our bang for our buck. I don't know if always going after something they don't have is our best strategy because A, it might take really long to coach, right? B, we might have to use loads that don't really give us a return on investment. So are we wasting some time? Whereas if they feel pretty good, we can go after stuff that they're already good at, and we can load it, and then maybe go after some of those other things on the back end. That might be a better strategy.
Okay. And then they just talked about upper body presses movements. So with a wide ISA, like with what we just you were touching on, like, you look at powerlifters when they bench and stuff with the super arch, it's like you're probably not going to give them more of that because it's probably going to end up hurting their shoulders.
No, that's why all those dudes are like, my shoulders kill. My back is jacked
so
up.
Like, probably need to figure something else out there. So like they gave an example, try to use like a Swiss bar or a neutral grip dumbbell bench press or like a landmine one-arm press. And they gave an interesting cue, which would pushing through the pinky and the ring finger, which I don't know if you've heard, but I don't think we've used it, which is a good one. And then just the opposite for narrows was push through the thumbs and the pointer fingers. And for narrows, I just said normal barbell bench press, pronated dumbbell bench press, and then a traditional push-up, which I think it's interesting with the argument of, what's the difference between all these different things? And it's like some might work better for different people. And like, I remember one of our athletes, like Matt, you're not talking to Haley, like, oh, you're not doing it right. And I'm like, you don't know that.
Yeah.
She's doing it. This could be better for her or whatever. I don't know.
Well, I'll give you a quick
It
example.
would be the
Right?
same thing for upper body pulling movements, huh?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
In terms of hand position.
hand positions. So remember we were doing there was that Christian Thibodeau like bodybuilding program that we were doing.
Yeah.
Right. So after like 3 or 4 weeks of that, my shoulder killed. Like it's a ton of pressing movements and it was a ton of overhead pressing, just like all crazy stuff. And like did not feel good at all. And it went all the way up into my trap and into my neck. And it hurt the most during any type of regular pressing this way. So all I did was reverse my grip, right? So I went into an externally rotated position in almost everything. So anything
But
that
you're
was,
narrow, right?
huh?
You're a narrow ISA?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had to lower the weight, and there's a couple of things that I did. And I reinforced a little bit more breathing, and all of a sudden, after like a week, I was still training, right? And this like calmed down significantly.
Yeah.
I then did the Bill Hartman's like upper back expansion with the miniband, upper dorsal rostral expansion, and that was like money in that everything just started to move again, and it all comes in with like, all right, biasing ER, making sure I
Which
can.
is strange because you think you'd be expanded in that space if you're compressed lower.
Again, you don't. This is the hard part, man. This is why you need all the different other tests to figure it out. Because if I have a narrow ISA, right? So I've got compression down here, and you would think that it would have to hyperinflate maybe up top, but I have full overhead flexion and I have full IR and full ER. It means that whole space is like it moves pretty well in all directions. So is it horrible? No. And like the neck should be able to move in that direction too. Would I change anything? No. But if all of a sudden I have, let's say, a limited IR, even though I have a narrow ISA, what that's telling you is that you probably still have a down pump handle on the sternum. So that I've got, again, my strategy is compression on this whole front side. And if I have then compression also on the back side or enough to limit anything else, I know I'm either blowing air out the back or up or down, right? I may get pelvis issues because you're right. I'm compressing this space so much. It's got to go somewhere. It may go down, which means you would have a compressive force in the pelvic floor, or I may have some neck tension because I have to maybe elevate a rib cage now to get some air in. And that's why you need to have all these other excursion measurements to kind of confirm whether or not this is the only thing I need to be addressing. And what was interesting was I changed all that stuff. And the big thing was like for all my press downs, like tricep press downs, all went reverse grip. All my curls stayed in that reverse grip and shoulder pain went away immediately. Right. And that's like, oh, cool. I still able to train. I just had to rebias some of my exercise selection to this. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, this is great.
So sometimes the exercise selection could vary, but do you think whatever variation you choose, the propulsion phases that you might operate within probably stay the same?
That's a topic for a different time. I actually have to figure that out because that's where I am getting super lost in
Well,
that.
I'm just thinking if you're narrow, whatever pressing thing you do, you probably want to operate in a mid propulsion.
So yeah, like right. Do you want to operate in that, or is that where you're going to feel the strongest? You know, if I want to bias you to a late propulsion piece in an IR position, which is as a mid propulsive like space, what does that do for you? I don't know, right? But like if you have a limitation in external rotation, you're usually going to have missing early and late propulsion strategies, right? If you have an exhaled strategy, which is IR, you'll usually be better in mid propulsion. So I don't know. That's the type of stuff where I'm like, especially for our athletic population, you know, like when we watch those kids that are smacking the ground with a full foot all the time, like, all right, what are we missing here? Is that late propulsion? Is that early propulsion, mid propulsion? What do we have to go after to get them to feel that they can actually load, like yield, and then concentrically come out of it in those spaces? Because I mean, that's where I was trying to figure out with the backwards walking and some of these other things. I think there's something there that we should be able to quickly implement and get them to feel that much differently. Does that mean we put them with the foot elevated on the front foot split squat so they're in mid propulsion on that front foot, or do we go more towards a earlier late propulsion? I don't know.
All right, topic for another day.
I agree. All right, man. Good chatting with you.
You too.